Three empires, Rome, Spain, Britain, collapsed in completely different centuries, yet followed the exact same economic sequence before the fall. And now, for the first time in history, that sequence is appearing again, in a place no one expected. Picture this. Rome, 476 AD. The last Western Roman emperor, a teenage boy named Romulus Augustulus, is quietly deposed by a Germanic chieftain. No great battle, no dramatic siege, just a whimper that ended over 1,000 years of Roman dominance. Madrid, 1700. The Spanish Habsburg line ends with Charles II, a king whose empire had already been hemorrhaging wealth and territory for decades. London, 1947. Britain, the empire where the sun never set, begins dismantling its colonial holdings not through conquest, but through economic exhaustion. Three empires, 3 different centuries, 3 remarkably similar endings. Welcome to empire economics, where history and money collide. Today, we're uncovering the hidden pattern that connects every great empire's rise and fall. A pattern so consistent, so predictable, that once you see it, you'll recognize its fingerprints everywhere, including places you might not expect. Because here's what most people miss about empire collapse. It's never really about the barbarians at the gates or the revolution in the streets. Those are just the final scenes of a much longer story. The real collapse begins decades earlier, in the quiet halls where financial decisions are made, in the ledgers where expenses exceed revenues year after year, in the moment when maintaining power becomes more expensive than the power itself is worth. Every empire that has ever fallen has followed the same 4-stage pattern. First comes overextension, where the costs of control begin to exceed the benefits. Then comes the debt spiral, where borrowing becomes the only way to maintain the illusion of strength. Third is the confidence crisis, where subjects and allies begin to question whether the emperor's promises are worth anything at all. Finally comes the cascade, where multiple systems fail simultaneously and the center simply cannot hold. Let's start with Rome, because their collapse remains the template for every empire that followed. By the 3rd century, Rome had expanded to control nearly 40% of the known world. From Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, Roman legions stood guard over an empire that stretched across 3 continents. But here's the mathematical problem that would eventually destroy them. The bigger the empire grew, the more expensive it became to defend. Consider the numbers. At its peak, Rome maintained approximately 28 legions, roughly 150,000 professional soldiers, plus auxiliary forces that doubled that number. Each legion cost the equivalent of millions in today's currency to equip, feed, and pay. But the real expense wasn't the soldiers themselves. It was the infrastructure needed to support them. Roads, fortifications, supply chains, administrative centers. The Roman military-industrial complex consumed somewhere between 60 to 70% of the empire's total budget. Meanwhile, the territories they were defending weren't generating enough wealth to cover their own protection costs. Britain, for instance, required 3 full legions to maintain order, but produced relatively modest tax revenues. The Germanic frontier demanded massive fortification projects, but offered little in return except the prevention of raids. Rome had fallen into the classic imperial trap. They were spending more to hold territory than the territory was worth. This forced them into stage 2 of the collapse pattern, the debt spiral. Roman emperors began debasing their currency, mixing cheaper metals with silver to stretch their money supply. The silver content of the denarius dropped from 95% under Augustus to less than 5% by the reign of Gallienus. Each debased coin was worth less than the one before, creating inflation that made everything more expensive, while making Roman money less trustworthy. But the monetary manipulation brought them only temporary relief. The fundamental problem remained. They were spending more than they earned, and the gap was widening every year. By the 4th century, Roman tax collectors were resorting to increasingly urgent measures, requesting payments in goods rather than coins, assigning hereditary service obligations to landowners, and enforcing collection more aggressively. This brings us to stage 3, the confidence crisis. When people stop believing in your money, they stop believing in your power. Roman citizens began hoarding gold and silver, trading in barter networks, and looking for alternatives to imperial authority. Provincial governors started making local arrangements with neighboring tribes rather than waiting for instructions from Rome. The empire's credibility, built over centuries, eroded within decades. But what happened next would change history forever. Multiple pressures hit simultaneously in what historians call the cascade effect. Climate shifts reduced agricultural yields. Disease outbreaks lowered urban populations. Political instability led to internal conflicts that drained resources and damaged infrastructure. And increased frontier pressure required responses Rome could no longer afford. Rome's financial system, already stretched to breaking point, couldn't handle the simultaneous demands. They couldn't pay their armies, maintain defenses, collect taxes effectively, or preserve order. The empire didn't fall because of any single catastrophic event. It declined because it had lost the economic foundation that made imperial power possible in the first place. Fast forward 1,000 years to Spain, and the pattern repeats with striking similarity. The Spanish Empire controlled more territory than Rome ever had, stretching from Mexico to the Philippines, from Peru to the Netherlands. Their silver mines in the Americas produced unprecedented wealth, flooding Europe with precious metals and making Spain the dominant global power for over a century. But Spanish leaders made the same strategic miscalculation as their Roman predecessors. They confused resource extraction with economic strength. Instead of building productive industries, they used American silver to fund prolonged conflicts across Europe. The Habsburg monarchs spent decades involved in wars in Italy, the Netherlands, France, and Germany, pursuing dynastic ambitions that were extraordinarily expensive. The numbers reveal the strain of imperial overreach. Philip II, at the height of Spanish power, was spending roughly 60% of his revenues on military campaigns. His successors pushed that percentage even higher. Spanish armies were engaged on multiple continents simultaneously, each campaign requiring massive logistical support and constant reinforcement. Meanwhile, the influx of American silver was destabilizing Spain's domestic economy through inflation. Prices rose faster in Spain than anywhere else in Europe, making Spanish goods uncompetitive and diminishing domestic productivity. Why build industries when imports were easy? Why invest in skills when silver seemed unlimited? This created the same debt spiral that had created problems for Rome. Spanish rulers borrowed heavily against future silver shipments, pledging revenues that hadn't been mined yet. When production declined or shipments were disrupted, financial instability followed. Philip II restructured or suspended debt repayment 4 times. His successors continued the pattern, adjusting obligations and currencies regularly. By the 17th century, Spain entered its confidence crisis. Other European powers became hesitant to rely on Spanish financial commitments. Colonial administrators began making independent choices rather than waiting for Madrid. The empire that had once appeared invincible was revealing itself as a structure dependent on fragile financial assumptions. The cascade arrived in the 1640s, when multiple regional uprisings occurred at the same time. Portugal restored independence. Catalonia rebelled. The Netherlands completed its long struggle for autonomy. Each challenge demanded military responses that Spain could no longer sustain, creating a loop of financial pressure and political instability that accelerated Spanish decline. Britain presents perhaps the most instructive case because its transition unfolded in public view. Unlike Rome or Spain, whose collapses must be reconstructed through limited records, Britain's imperial contraction was documented in real time. The The British Empire in 1900 was the largest in history. 1/4 of the world's land surface flew the Union Jack. British naval power was unmatched. London was the world's financial capital. Sterling was the global reserve currency, and British trade networks spanned the globe. But beneath this powerful image, the same four-stage pattern had already begun. Stage 1, overextension, was initially masked by Britain's early industrial advantages. Their factories, railways, and steamships had given them a technological lead. But by the late 19th century, that lead was shrinking. Germany and the United States were industrializing rapidly and challenging Britain's dominance. The financial strain was becoming visible. The Royal Navy required continual expansion to maintain parity with new rival fleets. Defending India consumed roughly 40% of Britain's military budget, while producing only limited financial return. Canada, Australia, and other dominions were seeking greater autonomy while contributing less to imperial defence. More concerning, Britain's economy was becoming increasingly dependent on imperial markets. Domestic manufacturers were losing competitiveness in open markets and relied heavily on colonial consumers. This created a feedback loop. Maintaining imperial control became necessary for economic stability, even as it became more costly. World War I triggered stage 2 of Britain's decline, the debt spiral. The war cost Britain approximately £40 billion, equivalent to several trillion today. Britain financed this through heavy borrowing, particularly from the United States, shifting from being the world's largest creditor to one of its largest debtors. The war also demonstrated a decline in British autonomy. Despite vast global resources, Britain required significant American financial support and eventual military assistance. The empire that had once stood alone now needed partners. The pattern is clear, but history isn't destiny. Understanding how empires fall doesn't mean accepting that they must. Every decline began with choices made quietly by leaders who assumed tomorrow would resemble today. The real lesson isn't about inevitable collapse. It's about recognizing when the cost of maintaining power outweighs its benefits and choosing adaptation over denial. History shows us what to watch for, not what must happen. This content is for educational purposes only and does not constitute financial, legal, or investment advice. If you enjoy learning how history and money intertwine, subscribe to Empire Economics for more untold stories.